I think the first thing that struck me about the similarities between our books is the like this like punk rock teen angst kind of aesthetic.
Do you remember in Power Rangers where the first line in the intro was like, get me some teenagers with attitude? Like
Yeah.
that was the first line. So yeah, that sort of like young rebellious character, like it's just sort of at least with that, because I grew up with Power Rangers, like it's part of that. And a Common Rider, like they're motorcycle guys, right? And when you think of a motorcycle person, you think of like a rebel, leather jackets, and not really following the law.
When you kind of look at mechs, it's like you said, kind of going against the grain, even just in terms of like the scale of things, right? Like these characters are so big and so
Hmm.
like imposing, right? And there's something very like angsty and punk rock about that, right? And I think for at least for like the giant mech kaiju kind of thing, there's this idea that like destruction, like just the inherent destruction of them being so big, you know what I mean? And them being so powerful and destructive that there is
Hmm.
going to be destruction no matter what. Like you can't avoid that,
Right,
right?
yeah.
And there's something very kind of rebellious about destruction. And I think like both of our characters deal a lot with like um maybe like trauma in terms of like, generational trauma or maybe just kind of societal trauma. And what's the
Hmm.
best way to deal with that than by like, wrecking buildings, right? Like another thing I was thinking about was how video game like the book is.
It's funny you mentioned video games because if the image I drew is
Mm,
is her playing the arcade
right.
machine. And that kind of goes back to that rebellious teen sort of thing you were talking about before, where like the arcade, at least when we were younger, that was like where all the kids hung out and they were like, there were no grown-ups around, so you could do, whatever you were gonna do. So it's funny. I wasn't even thinking that, but it totally fit that what you're talking about, this rebellious teens and video games.
Do you feel like in terms of storytelling, the video game kind of structure really helped you come up with the story? Because it certainly helped for me. I was like, yeah, there's four robots that they have to defeat. Easy. That's four chapters right there. Done.
Right. Yeah. 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 Because, so yeah, absolutely. It was like, okay, who are the bosses at the end of the stage and structuring the story around getting to them and how they sort of influence the rest of the stage. It definitely played like a huge role. Yeah. I totally see that. Yeah.
For my story, it's a bit of a, I don't want to say like a bit of a misdirection because you have these giant robots, but the battles aren't necessarily the focus of the story at the end of the day. You know what I mean? But they're more of kind of maybe metaphors for like other things going on. And I think
Hmm.
that's very evident in your book as well, because I think that the boss characters are representative of the themes that you're looking at within the story as well.
The fights themselves aren't super important. Like each chapter sort of set up a problem, like an emotional problem, and they would build towards it towards the end of the chapter. And the fight was just sort of like the icing. That was the cake. And I think your story is the same way too.
As I was writing it all the time, I was like, okay, but why are they doing this? Why is this happening, right? And then
Yeah.
that started to become the real thrust of the story. And then all of a sudden, the robot battles, I was like, yeah, yeah, let's worry about that later. Let's talk about the why right now.
They're both mecha stories, but they couldn't be further different in design. I mean, what made you think of doing it that way?
Think Bloom was the first one that I thought of. There's just this giant walking flower that can like shoot out these little like things. And so that was like the first idea. And I was like, okay, then what? And I was like, well, redwoods are really big. Those are
Hmm.
essentially mechs. So then it was a giant redwood. And then the third one, Willow, is like kind of like a scary character. It's the willow trees are kind of scary and they have like those, big things. So then that became that mech. Yeah. What about Taka? How did those designs come about?
One of the big influences was Mega Man,
Mhm.
on me just as a person. And I thought like, okay, well, how can I make my own sort of like Mega Man villains, like my own robot masters? And I was like, okay, well, there's always a theme. All right. So what's the theme? And I was like, okay, I'm going with animals, right? My theme was animals. So every sort of Mecha is a different animal, you know. My idea was like, okay, if I'm gonna make my own sort of Mega Man bosses, because like to go back to the video game idea, right? You know, how would I design them? And that's where that came from. It wasn't really like thinking like I wish I was as deep as nature versus technology. It was just like, what's cool?
Yeah, man.
I know the the story of the character I want to tell. Now, how do I integrate in the fighting element of it, the battle? And then I just started designing a bunch of different robots. I just started making them. And it was like, here's the monster, here's its ability. Almost like Sailor Moon, like where basically the enemy had one ability. That was it.
Yeah.
Like she just had to overcome one thing that they could do. And really, she could only do one thing also. She threw her tiara. That's what she did, you know?